The man who carried 4 revolvers for 20 years died in the few seconds he didn't have one. April 3rd, 1882, St. Joseph, Missouri. Jesse James removed his coat, his vest, and his guns. He stepped onto a chair to dust a picture. Behind him, Bob Ford drew a revolver, cocked it, and fired. The bullet entered behind Jesse's right ear. He was 34 years old. The most feared outlaw in American history was shot from behind while doing housework. But here's what made him feared in the first place. Jesse James didn't come from the western frontier. He came from the Civil War. Specifically, from the bushwhacker guerrillas who executed unarmed prisoners at Centralia. His tactics weren't Hollywood quick draw. They were ambush, volume of fire, and escape. Carry 3 or 4 revolvers. Fire 24 shots before reloading. Ride like hell. The Pinkertons weren't chasing a gunfighter. They were chasing a man who never stopped fighting a war that ended before he turned 18. This is the real story of Jesse James Revolvers. Welcome to Wild West Revealed. Jesse Woodson. James came into the world on September 5, 1847, in Clay County, Missouri, near present-day Kearney. His family were hemp farmers and slaveholders in Missouri's pro-southern Little Dixie region. His father, a Baptist minister, died when Jesse was young. His mother, Zerelda, remarried twice and became a fierce defender of her son's legend until her own death. The household's Confederate sympathies weren't casual politics. They were existential identity. The Civil War made Jesse James. His older brother, Frank, joined Confederate guerrillas first. Then, in 1864, Union militiamen harassed the family and tortured his stepfather for information about guerrilla movements. 16-year-old Jesse followed Frank into the bushwhacker ranks. He rode with Bloody Bill Anderson, the same man responsible for the Centralia massacre, where guerrillas executed unarmed Union soldiers. PBS describes Jesse as a teenager who never really stopped fighting the Civil War. That phrase explains everything that came after. Jesse didn't go west in the traditional sense. Missouri was the frontier, a border state torn apart by guerrilla violence. After the war ended in 1865, Jesse didn't demobilize. He and Frank simply shifted targets. Union soldiers became banks. Military supply wagons became trains and stagecoaches. The transition from guerrilla to outlaw was seamless because the tactics were identical. Bushwhacker culture demanded multiple revolvers. Historian T.J. Stiles notes that guerrillas carried 3 or 4 pistols because cap and ball guns were tiresome to reload and could jam after fouling with black powder residue. This wasn't showmanship, it was survival mathematics. Bloody Bill Anderson's death in 1864 haunted Jesse. 5 years later, he would ride into a bank in Gallatin, Missouri, believing the cashier was the man who had killed his commander. He shot the wrong man. But that came later. Missouri in the 1860s and 1870s didn't have general concealed weapons laws until 1874. Jesse's early robberies happened in a legal gray zone where carrying multiple loaded revolvers wasn't inherently criminal, just ominous. If you're learning something new about the real Old West, hit that like button and subscribe. We're just getting started, and the weapons details coming next are the key to understanding why the Pinkertons feared this man more than any other outlaw on the frontier. The Pinkertons weren't chasing a fast-draw artist. They were chasing a man who came out of a war where speed meant having the next gun already loaded in your belt. Jesse's primary sidearm in his early outlaw years was almost certainly some variant of the Colt percussion revolver. And the one that fit his guerrilla inheritance best was the Colt Model 1860 Army, 44 caliber, 6 shots, single action percussion, 8-inch barrel. Weight around 2 pounds 11 ounces. Muzzle velocity approached 900 feet per second with a full powder charge. The 1860 Army was the principal Union-issue revolver during the Civil War. Battlefield captures made them abundant in guerrilla hands. More importantly, the 44 caliber hit harder than smaller revolvers. For a mounted rider expecting to fire at close range and then escape, stopping power mattered more than long-range accuracy. But here's what Hollywood always gets wrong. That low-slung, quick-draw holster from every Western you've ever seen, invented in the 1920s for silent films. Jesse and his fellow bushwhackers wore their revolvers high on the belt, waist level, often in multiple holsters or tucked into sashes. Stiles describes guerrillas carrying 3 or 4 pistols at once. This wasn't about a single fast draw. It was about sustained firepower. The 1860 Army fouled quickly. Black powder grime built up in the cylinder. After a few loads, the action stiffened. The barrel grew hot. White smoke hung in the air. That's why you didn't stop to reload. You drew the next gun. Jesse also likely carried the Colt Model 1851 Navy, 36 caliber, 6 shots, 7.5-inch octagonal barrel, 2.6 pounds, muzzle velocity around 840 to 960 feet per second depending on the load. The Navy was lighter than the Army and balanced well for mounted shooting. Over 250,000 were produced between 1850 and 1873, making it one of the most common revolvers in America. If Jesse carried multiple guns, and he did, at least some were likely Navies simply due to availability. Here's another myth worth correcting. Hollywood calls the Navy a high-caliber revolver. It isn't. 36 caliber was considered medium bore by frontier standards. If you want actual high caliber, you're looking at the 44 Army or, later, the 45 Colt cartridge guns. The Navy was popular because it was lighter and faster to handle, not because it hit harder. The click of a cocking hammer, the slight front heaviness of that octagonal barrel, the smell of black powder after the first shot. These were the sensory realities of Jesse's arsenal. His early loadout wasn't about one perfect gun, it was about volume. Carry 4 revolvers, fire 24 shots before touching a powder flask, ride like hell. The Pinkertons weren't chasing a marksman, they were chasing a man who never ran dry. Those revolvers proved themselves in Jesse's very first named robbery, and that robbery proved something darker about the man himself. December 7th, 1869, Daviess County Savings Association, Gallatin, Missouri. Jesse and Frank rode into town and entered the bank. Inside were cashier John W. Sheets and attorney William McDowell. Jesse asked Sheets to change a $100 bill. The cashier began writing. Jesse drew his revolver. 2 shots, point blank. Sheets fell dead. McDowell fled. A 3rd shot caught him. He survived. The brothers mounted and escaped after a running pursuit through town. They got away with almost no money. Later, mythology framed this as a blow against the Yankee bankers, Jesse striking back at the forces that had oppressed Missouri. The reality was uglier. Jesse believed Sheets was the Union officer responsible for killing Bloody Bill Anderson 5 years earlier. He was wrong. Sheets wasn't that man. Jesse murdered the wrong person for a revenge he'd been nursing since he was 17 years old. Contemporary newspaper accounts confirmed the sequence. This wasn't a duel. It wasn't self-defense. It was an execution based on a case of mistaken identity. But Gallatin made Jesse famous, and for 7 more years, the James Younger gang operated with near impunity. Then came Northfield, September 7th, 1876. First National Bank, Northfield, Minnesota. 8 outlaws rode into town. 3 entered the bank, Jesse, Frank, and Charlie Pitts. 5 stayed outside to control the square. Northfield wasn't Gallatin. Inside, cashier Joseph Lee Haywood refused to open the safe. One robber cracked his skull with a pistol butt. Another held a Bowie knife to his throat. The safe's time lock made opening it impossible anyway. Outside, townsmen armed themselves. J.S. Allen shouted the alarm. Henry Wheeler fired from a hotel window with a rifle. Hardware store owner A.R. Manning grabbed a rifle from his stock and started shooting. The outlaws had revolvers. The citizens had rifles and a shotgun. Range decided the fight. Revolvers were close-range tools. Across an open square, against men with long guns firing from cover, the James Younger gang's entire tactical advantage collapsed. Frank James shot Joseph Lee Haywood in the head as the gang fled. Swedish immigrant Nicholas Gustafsson was killed by stray fire in the street. On the outlaw side, Clell Miller and Bill Chadwell died in the square. The younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, were all wounded and later captured. 7 minutes of shooting destroyed a gang that had terrorized the Midwest for a decade. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about real history over Hollywood mythology. Drop a like so I know to keep digging into stories like this. Jesse's backup wasn't a tiny Derringer. It was more revolvers. When your primary fouled or emptied, you didn't reload. You transitioned. But the strongest surviving provenance for Jesse-attributed firearms points to something the dime novels never mentioned: his evolution toward cartridge revolvers in his later years. A Smith & Wesson No. 3 Schofield, serial number 2299, was described by Carleton College's Northfield collection as Jesse's preferred revolver. 45 caliber, 7-inch barrel, top break action that allowed one-handed reloading on horseback. Only manufactured from 1875 to 1877, with about 8,000 ordered by the U.S. Army. The Schofield's shorter cartridge was its weakness, less powder than the standard Colt 45 load. But its break-open design was its genius. A mounted man could reload without dismounting. After Northfield proved the limits of percussion volume, faster reloads suddenly mattered more. Heritage Auctions sold a Colt single-action army attributed to Jesse in 2023. Serial number 70579. Authenticated by Colt authority R.L. Wilson, with provenance traced through Jesse James Jr. and Senator Harry Hawes. The front sight had been filed lower, possibly to ease the draw from a holster. The system evolved. Early Jesse relied on volume of percussion revolvers. Exhaust one, draw another. Ambush, fire, escape. Later, Jesse transitioned to cartridge guns that allowed faster reloading. The Schofield's top break action and the Colt SAA's reliability with metallic cartridges represented a tactical evolution. But the core habit, carrying multiple sidearms, likely persisted until the end. For close work, there was always the knife. PBS identifies a Bowie knife used at Northfield. One robber held it to Haywood's throat before the shooting started. The blade and the pistol butt were used together to beat Haywood when he refused the safe. Today, the Jesse-attributed Colt SAA sold through Heritage. The Schofield appeared at Bonham's. The Jesse James Birthplace Museum in Kearney, Missouri, holds the largest collection of James family artifacts. Though which specific revolvers are on permanent display remains unclear in available records. The man who carried 4 revolvers for 20 years died in the few seconds he didn't have one. April 3, 1882. St. Joseph, Missouri. Jesse was living under the alias Thomas Howard with his wife and children. Bob Ford and his brother Charlie had been staying with the family, secretly negotiating Jesse's betrayal with Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden. That morning, after breakfast and stable chores, Jesse returned to the living room. He said, "I guess I will take off my pistols for fear somebody will see them through the window." He removed his coat, his vest, his guns. He stepped onto a chair to dust a picture. Behind him, Bob Ford drew a revolver, cocked it, and fired. The bullet entered behind Jesse's right ear. He was 34 years old. Hollywood has told this story dozens of times. Tyrone Power in 1939, Robert Wagner in 1957, James Keach in 1980, Rob Lowe in 1994, Colin Farrell in 2001, Brad Pitt in 2007. The assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford comes closest to the complicated truth, but even it romanticizes the outlaw. The biggest myth that persists is the Robin Hood image. PBS and Britannica both confirm there is no evidence Jesse James ever distributed loot to the poor. He cultivated that legend through editor John Newman Edwards, but the charity was fiction. The robbery victims were real. The dead cashiers were real. The myth was marketing. Jesse James wasn't a Western gunfighter. He was a guerrilla who never stopped fighting a war that ended before he turned 18. His revolvers weren't symbols of frontier justice. They were tools of ambush, intimidation, and escape, carried in multiples because that's what bushwhackers did to survive. The St. Joseph house where he died is now a museum. DNA testing in the 1990s confirmed the buried remains were his. If you made it this far, drop a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the real Old West. Share this with someone who loves American history and who deserves to know the truth behind the legend.